So we started this evening, many of you weren't here for the beginning of chanting, but we started this evening remembering one of our Zen masters who died, Zen Master Daejin. Daejin's name was an American-born man. He was born in Philadelphia. My hunch is he died a year ago, and they were having the memorial service today for him in Korea. And I don't know his exact age, but my guess is when he died, he was about 57 or 56 years old. And he died of leukemia, which he battled for on about 2 years. He got a platelet transfusion, or a spinal, maybe it was stem cells from his brother, and he spent about a year and a half fighting. There's something basically called guest host illness. When you get a transplant, sometimes your body rejects the transplant, which is what happened, and he finally died. And besides just the importance of remembering someone who's passed, I think it's important. Let me frame the talk tonight. We're about 6 days past Buddha's Enlightenment Day. Buddha's Enlightenment Day in the West, especially in the Zen community, is celebrated on the 8th day of the last month of the year, which happens to be December 8th. And each year when Buddha's Enlightenment Day comes around, it makes me wonder, what are we talking about Buddha's enlightenment? And I suppose you could ask, what does that have to do with the death of Daejin? A short little story. The other night I was walking, and I was concerned about some things, how they were progressing, what might happen about them, and I was thinking about them, and I wasn't very happy in the way things were going and what I was thinking about. And then just the simple phrase crossed my mind that I was going to die. And it doesn't always work this way, but in that moment, it shifted things. Everything shifted in my mind. It was like what I'm doing and what I was concerned about was important, but it was put into a very clear perspective. That so much of what we worry about, what we're concerned about, the things that hold our attention, when you put them into the context of death, it shifts their importance. It shifts the meaning of things. So in one way, I think if we want to have any sense of understanding of what the Buddha experienced in his enlightenment experience and what it may mean to us, I think very simply we have to remember we're going to die. And not just that we're going to die when we're old and feeble. We don't know. We don't know. We don't know. In the news today, you hear about people leaving Aleppo and being shot and murdered and killed on the way out. Of course, they've been in the midst of a horror show for about 5 years. But that's not the way it's supposed to work. We've heard about so many killings in this country that happen, and we say, that's not the way it's supposed to work. It's not supposed to be you get pulled over for your headlight being out and you end up dead. But the reality of the experience in this country is that that happens. In this world is that that happens. We never know. And that uncertainty, on one hand, is very destabilizing. But then on the other hand, it's freedom. We don't know. We don't know when that death day is coming. What is most important? What is it that motivates our attention? Is it just the petty things that we get lost in, or is there something deeper? Something more profound? So, of course, when we talk about the story of the Buddha, he was a prince. He had everything he wanted. So much so, his father was so afraid that he would have spiritual inklings. Apparently, when he was born, there was a prophecy that either he would become a great religious figure or a great political figure. And his father was the king, and his father really wanted his son to be a political figure, not a religious figure. So he pampered him. He gave them everything he could possibly want. All the things that you and I dream about, he already had. So all of that energy we spend on wanting, every one of his wants was taken care of. All he had to do was voice it. And it happened from when he was a little boy. So that's all he knew. All he knew was riches and comfort and security. The story goes it wasn't until he was about 29 years old where he happened on, I believe it was a corpse. And he realized, oh, people die. And of course, there's a real irony in this story because his mother died 7 days after he was born. And he was raised by his aunt. So how could it be that he didn't know that there was death, and yet his own mother died? Something in that story that touches me is that even if he didn't know, the suffering was still there, waiting to be kindled. And when he saw that corpse, he realized that everything that he knew was fantasy. He had been lied to his entire life, been told that life was a particular way when actually it was quite different. And that blew his mind. So he left. He actually entered into something that was happening where he lived at that time, that probably mostly men at this point were leaving home, leaving their responsibilities behind, going out into the forest to try to discover who they were, try to understand what their true nature was. He practiced for 6 years, trying this, trying that, discarding this practice, discarding that practice, because they weren't answering his question. And then finally, one early morning, they say he saw the morning star, which, am I right that the morning star is Venus? Yes. Right? So he saw the morning star, and his mind opened wide. The boundary between self and the whole universe disappeared. And he recognized that the small construct of who we think we are is not the whole story. That there was something bigger, deeper, and more important that he could experience. And he realized that not only could he experience it, but it was true for everyone and everything in the whole universe. We were all the same. As the small, narrow personal boundary gets blown apart, the reality of the whole comes much more into focus. The story goes that he then thought, I'm done. Nobody in this world is going to understand this. So I'm going to enjoy it. Of course, language is very tricky. To say I'm going to enjoy it is back into that small-mindedness. But then there was a little tug on his robe, said, "You're not done yet." Maybe a few people will understand. Maybe. And from that he got up and he found 5 of his friends and began to preach. And to his surprise, people understood. Whether they could attain it or not, they understood. Many people understood. And it's actually my sense that most of us can understand. Most of us understand that the reality that we believe in is a fantasy and a dream. We don't often like to admit it, but behind that dream, our natural true self is not very far away. My experience working with people is that once reality gets raised, it's recognized. We get it. It's just that we stay trapped in that small identity. So this year, as I've been thinking about all this, those of you who don't come regularly, or maybe this is your first time, you don't know, we've kind of been in a dialogue the last few weeks about human life, emotions, sensation, how our place in our everyday life is impacted by our practice. So it was a natural extension to ask, what does enlightenment have to do with us? And if you heard when I was telling the story of the Buddha, I said his mind got blown with some kind of recognition of the fallacy of his belief system. And he left home. The tradition in Buddhism over the last 2,500 or more years has been to leave home. Interestingly, looking around this room, I don't see any home leavers. Although, that's what I planned on saying. Then I realized I left home. When I first came to practice, I did leave home. I left everything behind, just in some ways for the very same reason that the Buddha left everything behind. The sense that the world that I was faced with was a false world. And I had had enough experience in my college days to know that there was some other reality that could be integrated into life, that could add meaning, purpose, and direction to life. So I left, and that's how I ended up practicing Zen. But I never had whatever it is that makes someone decide to fully leave society and go off to the monastery or go off to the forest and just practice. I always kept a foot in an everyday life. Now, of course, everybody has an everyday life. Any monastic has a ritual and a routine to their everyday life. But I think the difference is that when we keep a foot into society, we're keeping ourselves connected in ways that make it much more difficult to let everything go. We have families. We have people we care about. We care about the political situation. We care about perhaps the violence and the pain that our brothers and sisters are facing every day, and sometimes ourselves. And we start to care about how things progress in this, what I call the human world, the world made of name and form. Our engagement in the world tie us to this world of name and form, which ties us right into desire, ties us right into ideas, beliefs, and passion. In the traditional sense, the person who practiced the Buddha way left it all behind. In some extreme cases, they went into caves and they sat there for years. The Buddha sat for 6 years. Bodhidharma, who brought Zen to China from India, sat in a cave for 9 years. When I was in South India, I went to visit the cave where Ramana Maharshi sat for 13 years. That's a complete severing of the connection to society and to the human world. In that context, you can understand enlightenment as a complete letting go. And when I was in Ramana Maharshi's cave, I was wondering to myself, why would somebody do this? I don't know why Ramana Maharshi did it, and I don't know why anybody else who chooses to do it does it. But what came to me, and this is in some ways verified from my own retreat experience, where when you do an extended retreat, there is some way that you're severing your connection for that period of time. And what can happen is you stop adding new experiences. And you allow your mind, in a sense, to unwind and let go. And you're not replacing it with new information, new experiences. So there can be a letting go. So, what does Buddha's enlightenment, what does Buddha's practice have to do with us? One of the things is we do retreats. We sit for longer periods of time. Every year here at Empty Gate, we do an 8-day retreat, starting in the first week in January in Providence, Rhode Island, which is the head temple of our school. They're starting a 3-month retreat, where some people sit day in, day out, every day, without any breaks, for 3 months. At Zen centers all over the world, people are doing that. In Buddhist communities all over the world, people take time out to go away. So there's something important about taking time and attention to sever the tight hold we have on what we believe reality to be. I think the one teaching point I want to bring up here is the general teaching point that those of us who come here hear all the time, and we're really meant to practice with it all the time. And that's the profound practice of not knowing. Zen Master Bon Soeng called it a don't know mind. He said, before thinking, your mind, my mind are the same mind. Your mind, my mind, this whole universal mind is the same mind. I begin to think, you begin to think, and that mind gets separated into me and you. Before the separation, we're all one. Before we make I, there's no I, there's no you. There's just this. So in some ways you could say the Buddha's enlightenment is about letting go of belief, idea, opinion, concepts and constructions. To see things clearly as they are, not as we think them to be. To practice don't know, it's a practice of moment-to-moment engagement with our lives. Bringing this not knowing to the very moment we're sitting in. So for me right now, it's bringing not knowing to this talk. to being curious and questioning everything that I'm saying. To let go of my constructs enough to allow something to emerge that may be different than even I expect. For you sitting out there listening, your don't know mind is challenging your assumptions, allowing the words that are being spoken to actually sink in, and allow the teachings to impact those beliefs, ideas, and opinions, and constructs. The Buddha's practice is a rigorous moment-to-moment practice. It's not some isolated thing that we do once in a while. It's easy when you're doing a 3-month retreat to just keep practicing. That's all there is. But in our everyday lives, we get lost in our desires. We get lost in our distractions. We're constantly creating experiences and conditions to reify our beliefs, our ideas, and our constructs, and our likes and our dislikes. So the home leavers have the benefit of letting go. We all have the challenge of doing it in the midst of the whole catastrophe, in the midst of our attachments. To be in a family and not care is not real family life. To disentangle ourselves completely doesn't work when you're in the midst of everyday life. So Zen Master Bon Soeng used to say the easy way to enlightenment was to go off to the monastery. The more difficult, but maybe more powerful way is to practice in the midst of everything. We're challenged by everything. And as we've been talking about the last few weeks, it's a both-and proposition. There is a letting go, but there's also a picking up. There is a recognition how our minds create our reality. And then there's also the caretaking of the reality that our minds are co-creating with everybody else's mind. So for some of us, it's political engagement, or social engagement, or family engagement, or just the everyday struggle of making ends meet and keeping our lives going. In the midst of that, we have to bring don't know. That not knowing throws us out of our comfort zone, but it also allows us to actually enter the moment more completely. Because our ideas, our opinions, our belief actually keep us a little bit separate. We build these walls around self, and then we're constantly protecting the self. Don't know mind opens that a little bit. It allows some of the unfiltered, maybe non-understood, non-rational reality to enter into our experience. And our practice is to be present and open. So I'll end with one more practice point, and then maybe I'll read a short thing that I have here. But that to bolster this practice of not knowing, we do this sitting practice and chanting practice and walking practice. Tonight, Paul gave us meditation instruction. He talked about breathing down into the lower abdomen. Zen Master Bon Soeng would say, making our center stronger. If we're going to have the capacity to live in this place of not knowing, we need some strength that isn't just mental, emotional, or physical strength. We need a groundedness. We need a way to hold our experience. So many of us, we understand this feeling of anxiety. Anxiety is such a common trap that we fall into. And in many ways, it's about not being able to hold the experience that we're having. So we have this formal practice of sitting to help us hold our experience completely. So Zen Master Bon Soeng would say, make your center stronger. Another way I like to say it is, expand the container so it can hold more. If our bowl is too small, just a little bit of milk starts spilling over the ends, over the sides. But if our bowl is bigger, that same amount of milk can fit comfortably in the bowl. And if our bowl is as big as the whole universe, then there's nothing that's rejected. There's nothing that can't be held. For most of us, a bowl as big as the universe is an archetype to work toward. But my experience does say that that bowl could get bigger. And actually, the whole universe is the bowl. So it really all can be held if we allow it to be held. I told this story about going through a difficult time and questioning really whether I could hold my experience. And then 2 weeks later, I realized, well, it's not comfortable and I don't like it. But actually, I am holding it. It's just that I'm reactive towards how it feels. And perhaps you could say what the Buddha discovered was that if you don't attach to your feelings as the most important thing, you have a lot more freedom. And if I can tie it back to the beginning of this talk, recognizing that death is just around the corner. To me at least, it puts a lot in perspective and allows that bowl to instantly grow. Because some of the things that you can't hold, you recognize either they don't matter so much, or compared to something more important, it's not as big a deal as it seems. Again, most of the people who come here know I use my own belief system and ideas as a way of teaching. So for me, these last month, well, God, it's a month already, of dealing with the horror of the election, sometimes I use, when I start to struggle with something, it crosses my mind, compared to the fact that Trump was elected, it's not that big a deal. Back in the 70s, I used to say, it's not as bad as what Richard Nixon did. When Bill Clinton was exposed for all of his sexual exploits while he was president, I was able to say, yeah, well, it might be bad, but it's not as bad as that. Or even the fear of humiliation. Well, I might be exposed for something, but it's not as bad as that. And it's not always, maybe it's a cold comfort on some level. But I think putting our lives in perspective gives us a chance to see more clearly what it is we're actually having to hold and what needs to be done and how to do it. But we do need our minds blown. We do need to shake ourselves out of the complacency of desire and then the fruits that come from that desire. So we often say suffering leads people to practice because we're looking for a way out of suffering. A lot of people come to Buddhist practice that way. Some people come to Buddhist practice because they've had an experience that doesn't fit into their construct. They've had a taste of something bigger than their small identity. And then we look for a way to live that. For me, it was a combination. But my direct entry into the Buddhist path came from experiences that blew open my constructs. And that's a great thing, to have your constructs blown open. But then you have to find a way to live. What people don't often realize in those moments of opening is that you're going to close. And unless you grab hold, you're just going to go back to your old ways. The power of conditioning is so strong that we need a practice to keep working that, to keep opening, to keep the channels challenged and opening. So I want to encourage all of us to find what the Buddha's enlightenment means for us. How do we bring that awareness, that recognition of emptiness, that the way we give significance to things is a creation of mind? And if we can use that recognition to find what's truly important and find our way forward in the world. So, yesterday morning, I was here for practice, and we were chanting the morning bell chant, and I was hitting the bell, so I got to read the page with the translation next to it. And in honor of Buddha's Enlightenment Day, I just want to read these 4 lines. If you wish to thoroughly understand all the Buddhas of past, present, and future, then you should view the nature of the universe as being created by mind alone. Then you should view the nature of the universe as being created by mind alone. So I'll end this talk with a question for you. If mind makes the universe, what happens when you drop your mind? There's no you, there's no mind, there's nothing to drop. Then what? This question opens us into the realm of Zen practice. Question? Comment? Anything anybody wants to talk about? There's a story. One second. I'll fill a little of the space. There's a story in Karen Armstrong's book about the Buddha, that when he was probably 5 3/4 years into his practice, he was getting very discouraged. He was using a lot of ascetic practices. The idea in those days was if you could just about kill the body, then the spiritual center would open. It was tricky because if you starved yourself too much, you would die, and then you lost it. And you only have one chance. You might get another one, but the chances of you being back in the same position aren't all that great. So you got to take advantage of where you are. So the Buddha was trying this, and he was just really discouraged. Wasn't doing it. And the story is that he had a memory of when he was about 6 years old, and he was in an apple orchard, and it was a festival day, and I guess the townspeople were harvesting apples. And generally, he was kept under tight wraps. He didn't get any freedom at all. There was always somebody with him. But in the excitement of the day, I guess his caretaker was off doing something, and he was left to himself. And kind of spontaneously, he dropped into a kind of trance or meditative practice and experienced deep bliss. And when he remembered that story, he said, so maybe there's something wrong with this idea that you need to destroy yourself to awaken. That actually, let's see how I can say this, that you can create more positive conditions that might actually allow you to open up. So the story went, when he realized this, he stopped starving himself. He started drinking some milk. And he actually lost all his practice friends when he did that, because he was breaking the code. And yet, he opened something up that helped him really discover himself. So, to me, the lesson there is to be careful about self-mortification as a way to enlightenment. That it's not about killing ourselves, it's about waking up and becoming who we really are. We come back into the world and we still have our small self, but our true nature is so much more than that. But yet, we still have it. And that those connections, that connection to life is still here. That's why I say it's both and. It's not either or. It's not you cut off everything and you're done. Because even if you leave your home, you are going to be somewhere. The flowers, the trees, the air, the water, everything needs caretaking. None of us are independent. We're all integrally connected to the ecosystem that we're part of. And what actually the Buddha teaches is that we have a responsibility to that ecosystem. If you just take what you want and don't nurture the system, then you kill the system and you kill the self. So we have this wonderful story about every time Zen Master Dogen, a Japanese Zen master, they said when he would go to the river to get water, he would put his dipper in the river, he'd drink half of it and put the rest back. That's an example of freedom, both disconnected from the human world and integrally connected at the same time. Almost can't even say it, let alone do it. But I think that's the challenge for lay folks as we practice the Buddha way and manifest the Buddha's enlightenment. To both be part of it, but not trapped in it. And each one of us find our own way to do that. Each one of us find our way to manage our connections and responsibilities along with the freedom of awakening.